Welcome to Produce Talks.
This whole business is based on relationship and friendships.
Food is darn simple.
What can we do? What are other countries doing?
How important it is for industry to be talking about this.
We're going back to the farm. We're going back to the whole food.
Hello and welcome to Produce Talks, the CPMA podcast. This episode, we feature a sustainability roundtable discussion from this past spring during the CPMA Fresh Week. The topic of sustainability in produce and what was discussed on this panel is wide-ranging, from packaging to biodiversity, benchmarking goals, corporate ESG structures, and much more. The panel was moderated by Scott Ross with the Canadian Federation of Agriculture and includes Keith Kuhl with Southern Potato, Quinton with Gwillimdale Farms, and David McInnes, coordinator of the National Index on Agri-food Performance. We'll get you right to the panel after a quick word from our sponsor, Nature Fresh Farms.
Hi there, it's Sarah from Nature Fresh Farms. Sustainable agriculture is a vision that many people across the industry have been contributing to, and as purpose-driven consumers focus on companies' sustainability and social responsibility, it is imperative for companies to keep pace with this demand. That's why Nature Fresh Farms is always incorporating new eco-friendly alternatives to help lead our community to a greener future. For more information on our growing practices, visit www.naturefresh.ca/sustainable-growing.
Thank you all today for joining us on this panel. My name is Scott Ross, and I'll be the moderator for today's panel on sustainability. For some quick background, I'm the Assistant Executive Director at the Canadian Federation of Agriculture, Canada's largest general farm organization. And I manage our policy team, and we are certainly spending more and more time every day on sustainability and its various facets. So with such a big issue in front of us, rather than take more time here, I'd just like to take a moment to introduce each of our panelists, and maybe they can tell us a little about themselves and their role in the agri-food sector. So first, I'll pass it over to you, Keith Kuhl, to give us a brief introduction of who you are.
Hi, I'm Keith Kuhl, operate Southern Potato Company in Winter, Manitoba. It's a family farm, so I have the privilege of working together in the operation. Thanks,
Keith. And next we'll go to David McInnes.
Well, hi, everybody. My name is David McInnes. I'm the coordinator for the National Index on Agri-food Performance, which is a private-public coalition advancing Canada's first sustainability index. Delighted to be here.
Thanks, David. And finally, Quinton.
I'm Quinton Woods. I'm the Senior Sales and Plant Operations Manager at Gwillimdale Farms. We're located just north of Toronto in Bradford, Ontario.
Great. Thank you all. And so as you can see, we have a really diverse panel here of different perspectives from the agri-food sector, touching on various aspects of sustainability. And maybe to kick things off, I think we just need to speak to the fact that, sustainability is really such a broad topic these days. And it seems like the efforts that fall under that heading are expanding and increasing every single day. Everything from legislation on plastics, efforts to support the UN Sustainable Development Goals or the SDGs, the development of indexes to measure these efforts, carbon sequestration, carbon pricing, all these other facets, and alongside an increased focus on biodiversity. All of these have different meanings for industry and impacts on how the sector operates. And I know within CFA, we really try to take on all these various pieces through a focus on farmer-driven approaches, highlighting what farmers are doing in this space, leading by example and showing best practices and trying to create spaces that those can be adopted. Saying that, I'd like to bring this down to a more operational level to kick things off and maybe ask Quinton what sustainability means to you in your day-to-day work before opening it up to some of the others to talk.
Thanks, Scott. Great question. Being a grower, packer, shipper of root vegetables, sustainability is very near and dear to our hearts. It really starts at the farm level with crop rotations, growing non-genetically modified crops as a crop rotation to prevent use of glyphosate, composting at all our vegetable waste mixed with manure to add back to the soil to supplement artificial fertilizers. And then we go into our packing facility, and it's truly about reduction of plastics, reduction of food waste, and what we can do to make our things better. We just invested heavily into long-term storages, where we've been able to reduce our energy consumption of our cooler units, which is about 250,000 square feet of storage, and we've been able to reduce it by 60%.
Thanks, Quinton. Yeah, that's a really, I think, sort of hands-on understanding of what that means at an operational level. I don't know, David or Keith, if you have anything you'd like to speak to about what sustainability means to you and your efforts.
Maybe I could just jump in, Scott, and Keith might have something to add. I think for me to boil it right down, is that consumers increasingly want to know where their food comes from. Is it being produced responsibly, sustainably? Is it causing harm to animals or to people or the environment? But this does go way beyond consumers. I think we're seeing buying customers in the supply chain. We're seeing investors. We're seeing regulators and, frankly, the global community and domestically want to know, are we sustainably producing food? So it's a guttural feeling. It's a feeling that's shared across many, many consumer demographic segments. And it's way beyond Canada in terms of this interest, concern, and for some, a real worry. So it's sparking a lot of interest.
Thanks, David. I don't know, Keith, if there's anything you'd like to add on that, or we can move on.
Yeah, I agree with the comments that Quinton and David made. I think that as we continue down the path of sustainability, we need to ensure that we're having a discussion across the whole supply chain, because when it comes to sustainability, we're all working together.
Thanks. Yeah. And I think, David, you touched on a really important concept there around transparency and sort of visibility into the supply chain. And Keith echoed that in his comments. And I think Quinton gave a really hands-on example of what that actually looks like. When we talk about that, David, you spoke to the demand side of that, where it's coming from. I guess the question I have is, what is the return on investment to those in the supply chain to really embark down that path and buy into that and provide that transparency and those sustainability sort of metrics to underpin their efforts? I know you've been very involved in looking at what's happening in environment, social, and governance investing, for example, as a space that's very fertile these days. And I'd welcome your thoughts on sort of what's the return on investment here to those in the supply chain to really take this on and lead?
Well, it's a huge question that probably we could devote a whole week to. I do want to just acknowledge Quinton's comment. I think sustainability starts with the landscape or the seascape. I think it's about making productivity and improvements, so that creates reducing inputs and maximizing profitable opportunities. So at the end of the day, sustainability starts with the producer. But if we look at what's going on globally, I'll just throw a number out here that's a pretty big one, and that is $100 trillion. Those are the institutional investors around the world. So they manage our pension funds, for example. And that's a figure for assets under management that subscribe to ESG, environmental, social, governance principles. And so what we're seeing are the asset managers, financial institutions, increasingly assessing risk of companies and supply chains worldwide against how they're managing climate disclosures, improving social outcomes, health, and environment factors. This is going to ultimately have an impact on availability and access to capital, and it's starting now at a nascent level, but it's transforming how risk is being assessed. And so by subscribing to ESG principles and improving sustainability, at the end of the day, it is about conforming to where the global capital markets are ultimately pointing the sector to.
Yeah, and thanks, David. I think that's a really important facet to the sort of triple bottom line of sustainability. We certainly look at farmer-driven efforts, as you said, as the starting point for all of that, as a real opportunity to hit all three aspects of that: the economics, the social, and the environmental sustainability components. And maybe Keith and Quinton, as people that have lived and breathed this through your own operations, I'd welcome your thoughts on sort of what you see as a return on investment in leading in this space and really taking steps towards addressing those issues.
I mean, David hit the nail on the head. It all starts with the land, but the reality is there's a lot of low-hanging fruit out there for operations to grab and implement in their own operations. ROI is always something on the forefront of every business person's brain, But the reality is a lot of these sustainability efforts actually have a very good ROI of 3 to 5 years, which are very good for operations in our industry. And the reality is they'll end up saving you money in the long run. For example, we invested heavily into that climate control refrigeration for our vegetables, but those are going to have an ROI of like 3.4 years. And then they're going to run for 20 more years. So it's going to save us a lot of money in the long run, a lot of electricity. But starting with the land and productivity, I think David really hit on a key point there is maximizing productivity off of what we do. And the number one thing that I think is going to be food waste. We have to acknowledge the amount of food we're producing in this country and globally and internationally, and how much food is being wasted and how we can direct that food back into either consumer stomachs or for further processing.
I agree with the comments that it all starts with the land. And in our area, it's 150 years ago now since the area was settled, and prairie grass was turned over to start producing crops. In a recent article that I read, the prediction was that if we don't change our practices, we're 60 crops away from our land failing. And so we have to ensure that we're taking care of the land. We know that every year there's thousands of acres of farmland that go to development. So the number of acres that we have to produce the crops is reducing. The global population is increasing, and as producers, we have to ensure that we're taking steps to ensure that the land will continue to improve for future generations.
And that's a great point, Keith. We often look at the issues around farmland preservation in Canada as a major sort of chronic issue that, because it crosses jurisdictions, isn't an easy one to solve. But certainly if you can control what you're doing on your farm and make sure you're doing everything possible to be a steward of that land for the future, I think that's obviously the first starting point there. David, was there something you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I just was thinking of your question, Scott, about the ROI for the producer and frankly for the supply chain. And that is access to markets. And that means or channel to markets. That means to the retail and processor. They're expecting greater sustainability performance. They're being measured by those investors and even regulators for that ESG comment I made, and also to subscribe to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, among some other goals. But also in our export markets, they're expecting greater transparency and disclosure against that progress, such as in the EU. So I think access to market is a little harder to pin down because it's not an immediate return. But if you lose your channel to market, that undermines the business completely or substantially. So it is a major driver of the value of improving sustainability disclosure and marking progress.
No, that's a great point. And I think when we talk about international markets, there's a couple different ways in which that can impact your operation. It's the direct access to those markets, but also a lot of these discussions are global. They're not occurring in Canada alone, and we are not operating in isolation here. So even where it's not an international buyer, I think a lot of the conversations we see playing out around the world tend to come home and have an impact on domestic markets as well. I wonder sort of what others think about that aspect of domestic marketing these days. Is you are not only reflecting sort of the demands of Canadians, but there's that back and forth discussion between, the Canadian consumer base, global consumers, and a lot of the dialogues we see around venues like the UN. I actually see a question in the chat that I think is really pertinent to this. Is one of the questions we hear time and again is, to what extent should we be responding to these sort of trends when it's not always easy to suss out what is a really legitimate push towards sustainability, or in some instances there may be ulterior motives at play and a sort of greenwashing of an initiative to bring in some other interests here. So it's a pretty complicated landscape. I don't think anyone can speak to all of it, but I'd welcome your thoughts on sort of how Canada can situate itself, recognizing, we are really at the part of a much bigger dialogue here. What can we as Canadian businesses and supply chains do to respond to that, be proactive in addressing it, and really address some of these questions around, outside activist pressure that may in some respects not be focused explicitly on environmental or triple bottom line sustainability? don't know if anyone wants to take a lead on that. I know it's a big question. Quinton?
I'll give it a shot. I think the reality is we have to ensure that our voice is heard at the table when these decisions are being made so that we can kind of flush out that activist voice. But the reality is we all have to take responsibility for our own actions. The world is a different place today than it was 50 years ago, and we have to be responsible for what waste we're producing and in our own operations. But sustainability goes way further, and it's starting to gain traction, and there's starting to become metrics and stuff to measure to, audits that are available to measure to. So there's enough concrete evidence out there that there is some hard wants of consumers and domestic and abroad of what they're expecting from us as producers. And I think there's some good starting points there to start from. And I think realistically, the activist pressure, there's always going to be there, but we can weed through that in an environment of today and figure out what consumers are really asking for.
Thanks, Quinton. David or Keith, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think that while we need to ensure that we're having a discussion across the supply chain and reaching agreement on what the metrics are for sustainability, in the end, I also believe that the function of carrying out the sustainability will probably differ for each operation because every operation is unique. Our lands are different. The crops we're growing are different, and so we will need to adapt our sustainability program to meet the needs of the operation. But at the same time, we have to ensure that we're also meeting national and global standards.
Thanks, Keith. And maybe, David, I know it looks like you have something you want to speak to on this front, but I think it's a good segue also to a discussion around a national index and what that does in helping diverse agricultural operations across Canada and our agri-food supply chains speak to some of what Keith was just saying. So I wondered if you could speak a little bit to the National Index initiative that you're involved in and leading on, and how you see that really speaking to some of what Keith just articulated.
Well, thanks, Scott. In fact, I'd like to sort of merge the comments a little of what Keith and Quinton said. I mean, if you want to boil it right down, if one says, if you say you're sustainable, the consumer in the marketplace and the regulator and the investor are saying, prove it. And so that brings you right down to the metrics, the verification protocols, or how you validate that. And that will be, to Keith's very good point, this will vary. It will vary from beef to blueberries. And there are different protocols, different requirements, different measures. And this is what frustrates, I think, people in and outside the sector, and including the consumer, is that how do I know there are so many standards and verification protocols? How do I trust this? There's probably not a panacea. There's no one answer, but one initiative that we're part of, which is a private-public coalition, as you mentioned, Scott, is the National Index. And it's coming up with a high-level set of metrics overall that really answers the fundamental question. How do we know that Canada's food system is safe, sustainable, responsible, and delivering highly nutritious food? And so we want to provide a high-level set of metrics to demonstrate that while linking up to the UN Sustainable Development Goals and some of these other initiatives. But the challenge is that this initiative can't speak to every company's, every farm's, every sector's own proprietary data or its own initiatives. So there's got to be a line here where it's a high level, but then over to the horticulture sector, over to the pork sector or the dairy sector to come through with more granular information that they require for their own supply chains. And so everyone is trying to figure out how to best do this without creating so much data that it becomes unwieldy and not useful. So I guess there's a bit of an art and a science to this, and the marketplace is evolving as people's expectations for sustainability and transparency change. But we got to start somewhere, because Canada's got a tremendous opportunity to stand up and show its sustainability credentials and the progress it's making. We could be a global leader in this. We're doing a great job now, but that standard, that bar is changing. So we need to step up.
Yeah, and I know at CFA we certainly see a lot of value in that initiative and are involved very intimately in a complementary one, I think, from our perspective, the Canadian Agri-Food Sustainability Initiative, which is really about trying to create a platform that can coalesce and convene a lot of that information in a fashion that lets, individual sectors, supply chains speak to the metrics they have available to them and centralizes a lot of that. And I think we could go on and on about sort of how the two are complementary to one another, but we certainly see a real opportunity here to build an infrastructure for Canada that helps us as a sector not only speak at that sort of grassroots level transparently, but at the sector level and at a national level as well. And I think the more tools we can give everybody to work on in this front, the better off we'll all be as we continue to see that evolution. Keith, Quinton, I don't know if you have any thoughts on what David said in that initiative and the value of sort of metrics when you talk about transparency, because we often can tell really great stories, but doing so in a way that actually responds to some of those international demands and standards can be a challenge at times.
Yeah, and Scott, I agree with everything David said, but I think we're providing some of the most basic nourishment in the world in food and produce, fruits and vegetables. And us as agriculture and horticultural producers, I think our biggest struggle is telling our story and making sure people realize that we are doing things sustainably, because realistically, if we're not, it's jeopardizing our own businesses a lot of the time. So it's measuring those metrics, but then also telling our stories as well and making sure that people understand what we're doing and they understand that it is being done sustainably.
Thanks, Quinton. Keith, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I would agree with Quinton. And I mean, when you look at the produce sector, and the produce sector includes many different countries and probably hundreds of thousands of farms. And for each of us to try to get the message out to the consumer is going to be very difficult. I think we need to work to develop tools to ensure that the consumer has the ability to see our transparency.
And I think this all touches on an issue that was brought up in the chat as well. A question that came forward is, what are people seeing as the top 3 sustainability metrics that they're seeing from retailers, from food service customers? What are they demanding? And where are they actually willing to compensate growers for taking those added steps? I think often we get to this question around there's a lot of demand and expectations on the sector, but when we look at marketing data, we see price is king still in many respects, and often consumers are still buying agri-food products based on sort of what's the cheapest, most affordable product they can find. How do you, as businesses, maybe I'll start with Quinton and Keith here, how do you respond to that issue? That I mean, we all understand the importance of affordability of food, but there is a whole lot more expected of growers these days and of the supply chain. And what are you seeing in the marketplace where there is actually that appetite to pay a premium? And how do you deal with that situation of increased expectations not always being reflected in the marketplace?
Yeah, and it's an excellent question. I mean, the reality is it would be very hard for me to come up with 3. I think the one and single major one is around the plastics issue and compostable and recyclable and biodegradable packaging as a whole is probably the single most driven issue from the retailers that we're hearing today, which is ultimately being driven by the consumers. 2 years ago, there wasn't a lot of options. Today, there is a lot of viable options for affordable, mostly cost-effective packaging that's readily available. There's lots of innovation around plastics, paper bags. Are they going to compensate for it? Who knows? But I think there's compensation enough when you go to the landfill and you see your brand on a plastic bag, knowing that it's never going to break down. I think we have a social responsibility there to ensure that we're not adding to environmental issues as operations. And as soon as we can switch over to any of these viable options, I think everybody wins.
That's a great point. And I do think there's always that question of sort of affordability on the alternatives that are there to help you address those things. But you spoke to that, I think, really articulately there. So, Keith, I don't know if there's anything you'd like to speak to from your experience, what you're seeing at that level.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I look at is, within Canada and the U.S., we basically have an unwritten cheap food policy. Statistics that I've seen in Canada, about 11% of the disposable income is used to put food on the table. I think in the U.S. it's as low as 7%. While I agree with Quinton that certainly there's areas where we can get a good return on investment by putting money into things like new storage and stuff like that. On the other hand, on the production end, as we deal with the land and we continue the work on regenerative farming and stuff like that, there's little doubt that our costs will go up. So part of the education also needs to be to ensure that the consumer understands that they will have to pay more for their food in order to ensure that there's going to be food for the world in the next generations.
Thanks, Keith. Yeah, and I think maybe I'll draw this back to that concept of at the investing level, David, and maybe just ask you, I mean, is there a short list from your discussions on some of the key issues that are being looked at here? Or is it really, I mean, this is a huge landscape of sustainability that has a lot of different facets to it. Is it everything and anything? Or are there a few areas you see as really being the sort of trend lines that are generating a lot of focus at the investing level right now as well?
Well, there are many goals. I mean, the UN Sustainable Development Goals are 17 in number. So we could go through that. But I think where the investing community, they're really looking at the GHG emissions, carbon emissions, as a key indicator of sustainability. There is something at the UN level that's attracting over 120 countries and many corporations about the race to zero, net zero by 2050. With interim targets to reduce GHGs by 2030. I think that is really driving a considerable amount of the global and investor dialogue. And keep your eye on biodiversity. The global goals for that are going to be renewed at the end of this year. That's going to attract a lot of attention. And I think what COVID has taught all of us, and I think the horticultural sector has been really leading with the response, is social aspects around the resilience of the food system and the dependence, obviously, on people. But I think social sustainability, we talk a lot about environmental sustainability, but the social aspect, I think is sort of, has really risen in the last 18 months. And I think will continue to do so.
Yeah, as someone who's been intimately involved in dealing with a lot of the labor challenges we've seen through the COVID experience, I think I'd agree 100% on that. The focus on social aspects right now is, I think, coming really to the fore, and is something that we've seen a lot of great leadership on across the country, and I think there's a lot of great work still to be done in that space and I already see underway here. At that point, maybe what I could ask is a bit of a forward-looking question of everybody here, rather than what's happening right now. I mean, let's cast out 5 to 10 years down the road. What do you see having changed in terms of sustainability efforts? What do you think are going to be the looming issues that maybe aren't capturing attention, or the sort of big thematic discussions of the day at things like we have the UN Food System Summit dialogues coming up, covering a variety of topics. I know Canada is going to be, CFA and others are going to be intimately involved in that. But we're talking about a very long-term discussion here, and maybe 5 years, 10 years down the road, what else do we see as being the big themes? So maybe I'll just ask each of you if you could speak to one sort of big concept you see that maybe isn't the issue of the day, but it is coming down the pipeline as something we're going to have to wrangle with. I think that would be welcome.
The biggest thing that we're seeing as an operation is just being responsible for your own food waste. And I think our 5 to 10 year is to be, coming to a point where there is zero food waste coming out of our operation. And we have to start looking and reflecting at ourselves as an industry, retailers, wholesalers, food services providers, producers, and realizing, what is acceptable to our consumers and what isn't acceptable to our consumers. Is it the carrot's too long? Is it too orange? Not orange enough? Like, we have to realize that there's consequences to every action, and that there is it's just an exorbitant amount of food wasted every year, and we need to, which is contributing to greenhouse gases in its breakdown, right? And we need to be responsible for our own food waste, and we need to find other avenues to get this food into a marketable format for consumers, which would allow us to offer cheaper food for our consumers in the end. So I think that's, as an operation, that's our number one goal, is to try and reduce our waste to net zero.
Thank you, Quinton. Yeah, and we're coming up on time here, so maybe just very quickly, David and Keith, if you have a one kind of high-level issue you could flag, I think that would be a great spot to end this conversation on.
I'll just jump in. I think we've been in a world of where we work in policy silos and not being collaborative in supply chains. There's no panacea here. Tensions will persist, but I think being far more collaborative and working as a food system is going to have to guide us going forward.
Okay, and Keith, maybe your last thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think for me, it's all about the land. I agree with Quinton that we need to focus on food waste as well. Over the winter, my sons and I have been having a lot of discussion on regenerative farming, finding ways to ensure that we have a crop growing actively on all of the land for as many months of the year as possible, because that continuous growth that will continue to improve the land.
Yeah, thank you for that, Keith. I think all of those are really significant looming issues and ones we're already dealing with to some extent today, but are only going to increase in focus. So with that, I think we're coming up on time here. I'd just like to thank our panelists for all of their insights on these, I think, really big, important questions we as a sector are going to be dealing with. And thank the sponsors as well as just everyone for the questions you sent in. I think it was a really good discussion and hopefully is the start of a lot more discussions on all of these different topics because to David's point at the end there, the more we can all engage in dialogue and collaborate on some of these issues, the better off we're all going to be served. So with that, I'll wrap up and just thank you all for taking part in this, and we'll talk to you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you to our panelists, and thank you to our listeners for joining in. Until next time, fill half your plate with fruits and veggies, continue to seek out new knowledge, and basically never stop growing.